So this morning we are starting off with a session on diplomacy, examining what it is like to work in that field and in an embassy. And this is a particularly crafted session where what we wanted to do was have two FIU alumni, one working in a U.S. embassy abroad and one working in a foreign to the U.S.'s embassy here in Washington, D.C. And we're glad to have it moderated by FIU's diplomat in residence, Rebecca Kimbrell. FIU's diplomat in residence is a position that, if you don't know, and it's for the South Florida region, but based at FIU, is to help all of you get into internships and careers in the State Department. So after we hear some great insights on their background from our panelists, Rebecca is someone you'll definitely want to stay in touch with for the long term if you're interested in a career in diplomacy. And a little bit more about Rebecca. Rebecca Kimbrell is a political track officer in the U.S. Department of State, who most recently served as the U.S. consul to Lyon, France from 2016 to 19. Prior to that, she was deputy director in the Office of Caucasus Affairs and Regional Conflicts in the department's Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. And she also served as a special assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. Some of her overseas assignments have included as a political officer in Kiev and as an economic officer in Ankara. She began her career doing a consular political rotation in Kingston. And this is kind of fun too. Before joining State Department, she served as executive director of the Nashville, Tennessee Sports Authority, the agency responsible for financing and overseeing the city's NFL stadium and NHL arena, something I did not know about her, and it's kind of neat. Abdel Perera, who is one of our panelists today, and Abdel and I went to FIU together as undergrads, so it is always a pleasure to see Abdel again. He's a consular coned foreign service officer, and coned means, I'll make sure that Rebecca brings out what cones are in the State Department. Currently serving as his third tour as the U.S. Consulate General at the U.S. Consulate General in Milan. His first tour as in the Foreign Service was at the U.S. Embassy in Buenos Aires, followed by an assignment at the embassy in Islamabad, where he was Deputy Fraud Prevention Manager. As he's currently in Milan, he's been intimately involved in the COVID-19 crisis at the post there. As most of our sessions have involved how the pandemic is affecting our panelists' lives, we'll make sure that comes up. Important note about Abdel is his path to the Foreign Service was characterized by some great internship programs that are available to you and that you can work with Rebecca on getting, including at the U.S. embassies in Uruguay and Peru. He was a 2012 Charles B. Rangel International Affairs Fellow, so we'll definitely want to talk about the Rangel Fellowship during this program. And our third panelist is Santiago Foldvari. He's the director of for space policy at the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, which is at the Australian Embassy here in Washington, D.C. He supports Australia's civil space strategy by facilitating commercial links between Australia and the U.S. with a focus on Moon to Mars missions. Previously, he's worked in government contracts for a cybersecurity firm and was Vice Consul for Trade and Investment at the British Consulate General in Miami. So there's multiple countries represented in diplomatic roles. He also, perhaps starting his career into public service, was a Peace Corps volunteer, or I should say is currently a returned Peace Corps volunteer, where he served in Kazakhstan. He has a MA from the University of Miami, but that's okay, and a BA from FIU. He's also done some courses at the Brookings Institution and Harvard's Kennedy School. So with that, I get out of the way. I turn it over to Rebecca to facilitate some great conversation with you about FIU alumni.
Great, thank you, Eric. Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to be with you here virtually, which has become our new reality. I can't wait to actually see people's faces in person this fall, hopefully, but thank you for joining us. Eric asked about cones. So what we used to call career tracks were cones. I was political coned, Abdel is consular coned. If you wanted to change cones, you had to be conally rectified, which sounds really, really awful and is about as painful as it sounds. So we moved to career tracks, which I guess makes more sense to people, so you don't have to explain cones to them all the time. But I actually deleted cone off of my bio yesterday before I sent it to you and put track in there, so we still say that. So good morning, everyone. I will be serving as mediator today, and I'm really happy to have two distinguished panelists with us. We're going to talk about the work of diplomacy and how our two panelists decided to get into diplomacy, what they think prepared them for it, etc. I'm going to start out by starting with Abdel. Abdel, broadly speaking, what do you think diplomacy actually is? What are the functions of the embassies? And what drew you to this career?
Well, thank you. And I just wanted to start off by saying thank you to FIU for putting this program together. It's a great time to utilize our technology to connect. And so thank you for including me in this program. And I hope everyone listening is staying safe and healthy during these certainly uncertain times, both in the United States and sort of worldwide. So to your question, I like to say that FIU changed my life in so many ways, but in one of them, it's that it got me on the right track in terms of what I wanted to do with my life. And I actually met a diplomat in residence at FIU who sort of had a class and inspired me to pursue this career. And so when I think about sort of what diplomacy is, I like to say that the Department of State is sort of the apparatus that we think of when we think of diplomacy, but it actually includes a wide range of actors, internationally, domestically. It involves civil society, it involves government officials, and so we work with a variety of partners all over the world to make diplomacy happen. And so you spoke about tracks and career tracks. Just so everyone knows, there are 5. And so it's consular, public diplomacy, political, economic, and management. And each of those functions or each of those career tracks allow you to do different things in the department, whether you're overseas or domestically. But there are also a wide range of opportunities to work cross-functionally, if we call it. So I, as a consular officer, may also be called upon to do a public diplomacy job, or may be called in to do a political job. So we wear multiple hats, and I think that is what makes this job so dynamic. And overseas at embassies, we have about over 230 missions worldwide, where we represent the United States, and we represent our interests, our goals, our principles, and we utilize diplomacy as a tool to get us there. So it is more of it's the way we facilitate exchanges. It's the way we facilitate basically opening up new markets, opening up new conversations internationally. And so that is what I like to call diplomacy. There's a lot of exchange in there. And so in the context of what we do at the Department of State, our number one priority is always the protection of American citizens, right? So our goal overseas, especially during these times, it's the protection and safety of American citizens. So we do a lot of that, and I'm happy to go into that in the Q&A. I mentioned a little bit about promoting US markets, because at the end, we also live in an economically driven world. And so opening up markets, supply chains, we've heard that a lot during these last couple of months, because it's really been tested in the times of a pandemic. And so it's what we do. It also opens up the value of democracy, including elections, human rights, and tackling really the world's issues that we live in daily. So through our reporting, through our work overseas in diplomacy, we're able to tackle those issues.
Great.
And so, yeah, so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wanted to move to Santiago as well. Santiago, do you want to talk a little bit about your perspective working in a foreign embassy here in the United States, and how you have seen your role, number one, and also how you've seen the bilateral relationship and diplomacy work from the other side?
Sure. Hi everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. Abdel gave you a textbook phenomenal answer on what diplomacy is, so I'm not going to try to beat it. my role at the Australian Embassy is, and just a little bit of a correction from Eric's intro, I'm not Director of Space Policy, I'm Director of Space Industry. There's a bit of a difference. The one thing you should learn about diplomacy is that tiny little words and commas matter a lot. It's a bit like being a lawyer. So the difference between policy and industry is quite important, even though it's not that big of a change in title, if you will. So my role at the Australian Embassy here in the US is to support our civil space strategy. Australia created a space agency in July 2018. Hard to believe that Australia did not have a space agency, but it did not. And then my role, once the policy was created and the agency was stood up, was really to execute the policy. And that meant supporting all of Australia's space technology companies, find supply chain partners in the United States, and likewise work with US companies you've heard of, big ones, and maybe not so big as well. Find opportunities in Australia for, say, manufacturing, robotics research, even access to space, or what in the US is called as launch. And then also we are working with commercial actors in both countries to help inform policies both in Australia and the US. For example, export controls. If you get into anything that's a defense technology, you'll hear all about things like ITAR and things like that. So trying to influence them so that they're a little bit more permissive of commercial partnerships and to help build the economy in Australia and likewise in the US.
Great, thank you. Santiago, what, kind of building on that a little bit, how does one prepare for such a role working in diplomacy, regardless of which job that they're working in? What do you think are the key skills that one would need, a student would need, someone who is interested in becoming a diplomat? How would they prepare themselves for that role?
So to work in international affairs, let's see if we can broaden a little bit from diplomacy. Let's just say we're all international affairs actors in some way, helping to improve the countries that we come from and hopefully live in as well. So you prepare. Look, there's a lot of serendipity. In statistics, they call it stochasticity, but stochastic, it just means randomness. So there's a bit of randomness as well. I was a student doing my graduate work at the University of Miami, having just returned from Kazakhstan, and there was an opportunity to do an internship. Some of the work I'd done in Central Asia at one of the consulates in Miami, and they were interested in me because of where I lived in Central Asia, and also because my mom had British nationality. So, I just happened to meet someone for a cup of coffee. There was a person who worked for the state of Florida at the time. He's now with the U.S. State Department. He gave me a call and said, "Hey, there's a consul that's looking for someone like you." I happened to know him just socially. He was almost like a neighbor. And so, look, there's no easy way to do this. There's a lot of randomness and serendipity, but also what you choose to focus on is what grows. So if you're really focused on an international affairs career, whatever that may be, it could be with the State Department if you're a U.S. citizen. There are also a lot of what are called, at least in Australia, attached agencies. So to be a diplomat, if that's what you want, you don't just have to focus on State Department. You can focus on the Department of Commerce, the USDA, Department of Treasury, FBI will send people abroad, DEA. There are other agencies that don't need to be named. USAID, if you're more interested in aid work. An embassy really is not a building that is owned in the case of the USA by the State Department, but in the case of Australia by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. It's really, think of it more as a mini version of a capital city with a lot of different agencies working in an embassy.
Great, thank you.
I guess I'll leave it there for now, yeah.
Abdel, Would you like to talk a little bit about the different fellowships and things that you did in your preparation to join the State Department, and what you think are the most important skills that one can bring to the table?
Definitely. So Santiago gave a really great intro to that section. And I just like to say that the number one thing I would recommend to everyone, especially at this stage in your careers, it's never to say no to an opportunity, because you never know when someone's going to say, hey, you should definitely apply to this. And you never know what that's going to lead to. And that's exactly what happened to me. You know, I was sitting in the class, I was basically told, hey, you should consider applying. And I remember it was kind of also mandatory for the class to everybody apply for an internship. And it led to a lot of us to apply and go on these like world adventures that we never really thought we would even be able to access, right? So I would say look at those opportunities and apply. And I think a few of us are a testament to that process. We also, always like to say that you should definitely be identifying mentors at this stage in your careers, because these are the individuals that can sort of guide you, but also when opportunities come, you know, they'll be able to think of you as a possible candidate for some of these things. And also, we are unique as a nation. You know, every time I go talk to groups of students, or you know, whether it's in Italy and in Pakistan and Argentina, and they say, wow, this Cuban guy is representing the United States. And I'm like, yeah, you know, we have that opportunity in the United States to really work in any sector we like, and sort of use our merits and our work and our ethics to move up and do different things, where in other countries it's kind of a whole different process. But some of the skills I would say that I would recommend you to start looking into, of course, academia is always important. It's important to know about history. It's important to know about institutions and how they work together. But also, you know, the skills of interpersonal relationships, negotiation skills, strong writing skills that take you from like your 2,500 word essay in your English 1101 class, if that's still how it's called, into like small elevator briefing skills. It's instrumental in the work of diplomacy. And just to give you a sort of a few examples of that, when you're joining the Department of State, they assess you on like 13 dimensions, and so they go through a whole list of things that you should have as a diplomat. And one of them is writing skills, and so those are things that I always like to amplify. And of course, managing people is really important, and you know, in diplomacy, and as well as any place you go in your young careers. But I think that we move around the world, and we manage people from various cultures, and sort of we have to be very adaptable in the way that things happen. And what may have worked in one country is not going to work in another. What works in the US certainly does not work in many places around the world. So we also have to become very adaptable in those situations. You know, I'll give you a real life example. I was in Islamabad working, and this idea of bringing the concept of Halloween to Pakistan came up. And public affairs had this opportunity, like to do a table, a sort of interview that we would then release through social media. And we all wore our costumes. And I was like a Power Ranger, and you know, and people just went through and talked about culturally what it meant. It got picked up by the media, and the next day we were all over Pakistani like television. So the importance of sort of being able to have the skills to do things that are out of the box is very important, I think.
Thank you. So I want to turn a little bit to the nuts and bolts of how our different departments. Santiago gave a great rundown of all the many different agencies that we often have serving in our embassies and consulates overseas. But I'll go to Abdel and then Santiago, and then for the next question, I'll shift back and forth so that I'm not starting with the same person each time. But Abdel, would you like to talk for a second about how not only the different agencies work together in an embassy abroad, but also how we make policy with not only the State Department, our leadership there, but also with the legislative branch, with other parts of the executive branch, and even sometimes with our judicial system?
Definitely. Well, this is always a great question because everyone thinks, you know, those photos on Facebook where they say, well, this is what mom thinks you are, and this is what your friends think you do. And this, you know, there's a lot of things that we do that are a lot of paperwork and just behind a desk and sort of tracking things that we report back to Washington, because the information we see overseas is valuable in the foreign policy apparatus, right? And so we use a lot of symbols in our policy making, and one of our biggest sort of symbols is our embassies, our actual building, our flag being raised in a country. It's a big symbol that we use continuously in our policy making priorities, because our presence in a country establishes a bilateral relationship, and in some places dates back hundreds of years. So I first like to say that just our presence in some countries has a really big impact on our policy, like overseas. We cannot tell a country what to do, but we can certainly try to influence a lot of what we can share and our common sort of goals, and they could be on the economy or human rights or etc., as I've mentioned. But we do this also through things like American Corners, and we open American Corners in certain places where it's like this little like office or a place where people can come and learn more about the United States. And our consular services, it's the first, you know, for some people overseas, it's our consular services is the first time they interact with an American. So whether, you know, they get a visa to go to the US or not, I think it's a huge part of our policy apparatus. And we have to work with a variety of branches in the United States to come up with laws and implement laws that protect our borders, but also sort of increase our legitimate travel and exchanges, right? We have I talked a little bit about reporting, because for those of you who don't know, there's a lot of things that are written that go back to Washington, because our leadership in Washington has to be informed, right? Like, especially, I'll give you an example now of the COVID-19. Everything that we're doing in Italy gets reported all the way up to the White House task force, because they are interested in knowing, okay, what is wrong in Italy, what's going on, and how can we help? Because helping in these times are important. So we not only have, as Santiago mentioned, Department of Defense, Energy, Treasury, Foreign Commercial Service, Transportation, CVP, DHS represented in what we call our country team at each embassy, but we also very frequently interact with other branches of the government, be it to implement policies dealing with immigration issues, or simply because we want to do an exchange program, for example, for students. And so but we also work extensively with the local government on various levels. And all of those individuals represented overseas have their policies and goals and priorities that are also being enhanced while serving overseas.
Great, thank you. And Santiago, you've spoken some about what you do, how you've intersected here with different industries in the United States, also I'm sure with different agencies. But could you talk a little bit about your interaction with DFAT and the other, I guess they call them departments in Australia, not ministries, but how the foreign policy, the foreign affairs apparatus works in Australia? Is it somewhat different, similar to the United States, and how you fit into that a little bit more?
Sure. So I should say collaboration, interagency collaboration at an embassy. It's definitely, I believe, increasing from the time that I started working. So before, everything was quite siloed. By design at times, but now that is no longer the optimal. So for example, I sit in an interagency space working group, which is chaired by the Air Attaché from the Royal Australian Air Force. And there's me representing sort of commercial industrial interests and linkages, and sharing those insights from industry about how we can inform our policies around space defense and civil space. So you break it down into both. So we feed into the defense as well as the civil. There's representatives from what is called the Department of Industry, Trade, Innovation, and Education. It's always changing its name, but think of this Department of Industry. And actually, the space agency, the Australian Space Agency, sits under the umbrella of the Department of Industry. So they've got a person posted here. We also have people from the Department of Defense as well, who, for example, buy a lot of technologies from the US for the armed forces back in Australia. So there's quite a lot of collaboration. We've got people who congressional liaison teams, so people who basically spend their day on the Hill, not at the embassy. And I think that's another thing that's changing. It's not just the interagency cooperation and collaboration to represent the interests of Australia, but also being outside of the embassy. Now, of course, we have no choice with COVID-19, but well before COVID-19, the emphasis was on getting out. So, for example, we just changed ambassadors for our previous ambassador. He always told me, don't bring people to my office here in Washington, get me out on the field. I am not the ambassador to Washington, I'm the ambassador to the US. So I want to go to different places. So I traveled with him, and we visited big cities, Miami including, but also smaller cities like Huntsville, Alabama. So being outside of an embassy as well is something that's changing. Now, there are jobs where you need to be at an embassy, of course, because you're client, you're facing, say, visa applicants or whatever. But by and large, I think it's another trend. At least for the Australian embassy. I don't know about a U.S. embassy.
Great, thank you. Let's talk for a moment, Santiago, if you'd like to start with this question. Talk a little bit about, I guess, what we were talking about yesterday as citizen diplomacy. How does the public, how do Australian citizens, how do American citizens, how do we play roles even as private citizens, as diplomats? And do you think that the relationships between any two nations are solely in the hands of diplomatic officials and the ruling party, so to speak, or do you think that person-to-person relationships play a role?
Yeah, so I 100% believe each of us plays a massive role, whether we're part of a State Department or counterpart anywhere in the world, or whether we're normal people going about our day. Anytime you travel, you are representing your country, and people will form opinions of you. So, for example, I happen to have a few citizenships. One of them is US, so I did serve in the US Peace Corps before I started any of the work that I do now. And I was in a small village outside of what was then the brand new capital of Kazakhstan, which at the time was called Astana, and now it's called Nur Sultan after the first president. But this village was 900 people. The embassy, even though the capital city was the capital city, it was only 30 kilometers away. Nobody had yet moved, or very few countries had moved. So I was really the first American person they'd ever seen. Now you can tell by my name and the accent that I'm actually not, born and bred American from the Midwest. So people were surprised, much as Abdel said that sometimes people are surprised that a Cuban would be working, like Cuban American would be working at an American embassy. People were surprised that someone, me in my case, born in Argentina, would be representing the US. And so you do have a responsibility. I try to conduct myself in the very best way that I could. At the time when I lived in Kazakhstan, it was challenging times for an American in Central Asia. It was in the middle of the Afghanistan and Iraq situation. So I had to answer some very tough questions that people were asking of me as a normal American. And now you can imagine as an Argentinian American with British connections who works in Australia, in Washington, D.C., I surprise a lot of people. Sometimes I even disappoint them when they want to hear a proper Aussie accent, and then here I show up. But at all times now, I happen to represent almost the best. I want the best connections and the best economies and the best welfare for Australia, and also for the US. I've got a lot of skin in the game. So absolutely, all of us have a responsibility to represent the country. Diplomacy is not solely at the hand of those who are privileged to serve. It's the responsibility of every single person to do the best for themselves and to represent the best interest of wherever they come from. Thank you.
Thank you. And Abdel, I'm going to take this just a little bit further as an American diplomat, and I've seen it as well when I've been serving overseas. How have you seen the role of the US media affecting your job, your ability to communicate and advance US policy when everyone seems to be able to see our news, our television shows, our movies, our newspapers, our social media? How has that played a role in diplomacy and foreign affairs?
That's a loaded question. Thank you. Well, Santiago also, he placed it perfectly. I strongly believe diplomacy cannot exist without the support and engagement of regular citizens, whether it's civil society, NGOs, religious leaders, educators, researchers, etc. Each person plays a role in our diplomatic work. And media definitely has a big influence on that, particularly as a diplomat who arrives in a country and you're trying to do what you can do to promote US values, interests, etc. And then the media in the US is carrying maybe a different story on a topic. But we also always bring it back, and I'll give you a very interesting example. I arrived in Islamabad the day sort of after the elections in the United States, and I think there was a lot of talk about immigration issues. There was a lot of talk about certain policies on groups, etc. It was really our role while we were there to represent what the facts were. And not being political, because the Department of State is sort of, we work for any president, right, as foreign service officers. And so our goal and our objective there was to work with all of these groups, our citizens, through engagement and exchanges, to explain what these policies meant and how we could make it work in their situation. And I think that I'm asked a lot of time as a consular officer at the visa window, when I interview people for a visa, I'm always asked if I'm refusing someone. From time to time I get can I speak to a real American? And it always sort of shocks me a little bit, but it's true. And to Santiago's point on this, people don't expect us to be sort of the face of the United States, because there's this sort of, well, this is the image of an American. And I think that's been in the media and movies, in the ways that the typical American is represented. But that is changing, and is our work in diplomacy to try and change. And that's why we send and go to different places around the world to show sort of what the real America is, which is sort of this melting pot or a salad with a lot of different nationalities and different things there. So
great. Yeah, I would say that I'm Southern. I'm the first girl in my family to go to college as well. And so I too, when I was overseas, especially in more conservative cultures, I would also get can I speak to your manager kind of request, because, how could this girl with a Southern accent possibly have a position of authority over someone else? So yes, I think that's the beauty of the US Foreign Service, is that anyone can become a foreign service officer in the United States, which is not always the case in some of the other countries.
And I always have a ball when I try to explain I'm a Cuban American U.S. diplomat with Abdel as my name, right? So it's sort of in some countries that's always been, but how, you know? And it's definitely important to, in every interaction that we have, and also when all of you go overseas, you know, we always say you are our country's ambassadors, and people are cognizant that you're there, people are aware, and anything you do on your actions sort of get translated a lot into what perceptions people have of our country and our citizens.
Absolutely. Alrighty, so we're going to close out here with some questions that I always get from students when I'm giving presentations very quickly. And then for everyone who is here participating, if you have questions, I think I forgot to mention at the beginning, but we can do it now. If you wouldn't mind, start typing them in the chat box here in Zoom. We'll go through them, see if there are similar ones, and then when you have your name, we'll ask you to ask your question on camera after we've taken a look at them, if that's okay with everyone. So for Abdel, what's your favorite part of the job? What's the hardest thing? And what would you tell your younger self as you were preparing for this role?
Great. I always love this question. You know, my favorite part about being a diplomat and representing the United States is that I get to make a difference every day, you know, whether it's on the visa line or whether it's on an important mission overseas. There's never a dull day in the work that we do in diplomacy. One day you're preparing a presidential visit, the next you're on TV giving an interview on a foreign language, nonetheless, and the next you're hosting a Game of Thrones a series opening party at an ambassador's residence. The dynamism is what makes my day so interesting and the stories so interesting. I think the hardest part about being a diplomat, I would have to say, is the impact it does have on your family. And that is something that we take with us when we start off this career and this path. And our families, I think, are also ambassadors of our country. And so, you know, my wife, she has had multiple jobs already, like overseas. She's done anything from working in a health unit to working as the ambassador's photographer. So it's sort of, they also require a lot of flexibility, and there will be a lot of times you miss important events in the lives of your friends and family. But I think technology has helped us a lot in that regard. And finally, what advice I would give to my younger self in preparing is, one, never doubt your story and yourself. You know, I'm from Hialeah. If you're from Miami and you're from FIU, you know, I say that everywhere I go. And I say, I'm an immigrant who came to the United States, who was able to go through the education system, able to go and pursue this dream of mine of becoming a diplomat of the US. And so share that widely. And I would definitely tell myself, my younger self, to believe in that story. And also to learn a language, please, because it is definitely more and more needed as we conduct our work of diplomacy. And definitely take an extra class of quantitative analysis, because math is not my strong suit, and sometimes it does come in handy. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And Santiago, the same questions for you. What is your favorite part of the job? What do you think is the hardest part? And what would you tell your younger self?
My favorite part of the job is that whenever I'm a very curious person. And so whenever I have a question about, hey, what's it like to live on Mars? I can call SpaceX and ask them, and they'll take the meeting, and we'll have breakfast and we'll talk about things. So the access to incredible people is really phenomenal when you're in this sort of career, because you're adding value to companies like SpaceX or Boeing, and you have access to the very best people, and you build relationships with them. They trust you, and you can have very casual conversations about just incredible topics. So I think that's my favorite part of the job, satisfying my curiosity with the very best experts I can find. In terms of, I'm going to definitely second Abdel's quantitative claim. So when I was coming up, math was something you ignored because it was difficult and because you didn't see the application. How's math going to come in handy when I want to represent the interest of a country abroad or whatever? And I cannot begin to tell you how important math and science are. So we talk about big data a lot, but I don't really like that term. Really, what big data means is that the data, the facts, the probabilities, they start learning to think about probabilities. Life is nothing certain, nothing's black and white, everything's a probability. So the data informs your belief rather than the belief informing your data. So the difference between that, it becomes sort of a core principle of mine. It's the first principle I always go back to, which is embrace reality as it is and not as you wish it would be. So quantitative, the math, the sciences really get you there. And maybe you don't have to study them formally, but I go back to curiosity. Become curious about math, become curious about physics, because they can solve so many problems. Most 99.9% of the problems you face in your life are problems that other people have faced before. So don't try to reinvent the wheel. And most of them go back to very simple principles. Even COVID-19, it seems like unprecedented, and it's not. People lived this in 1918. People lived this other times before. So just because it's a 1 in 100 year event does not make it unique. And there's a lot we can learn from just the math and the science of how these things get beaten and overcome. Did I miss any other part of the question, Rebecca?
If you want to quickly say what your least favorite part of the job is.
Oh, my least favorite part of the job is some of the reporting. Abdel also mentioned this. There are times when you get locked in, chained to your desk, writing a report that you know very few people are going to read, but it's part of the convention. I'm really hopeful that some of this is starting to change. So I can tell you, for example, I have an event with the ambassador tonight. I'm doing a digital event, and before that would have meant pages and pages of briefings and bios, and he just wanted a quick 3 to 5, when in Australia called dot points or bullet points. And this is unprecedented. So I'm really hopeful of some change in all of this. And also for me, in my case, I also have to track relationships. So for example, if I speak with a company, who am I speaking with? What have I said? So that if I disappear, or my colleagues in Australia have questions about the company, they know who I'm talking with. So I spend a lot of time on what's called CRM, customer relationship management software, so Salesforce and things like that, tracking every interaction that I have with everyone, which is not fun.
Thanks so much, everyone. Okay, Eric, so how should we handle the questions? Do you want me to go through them? Have you already taken a look at them?
I'm taking a quick look. I wanted to confirm with our panelists, Santiago, you had a hard stop at the end of this hour still, right?
Yes, I can stay on for a few extra minutes if there's questions. So
okay.
Just about maybe five or so minutes, yeah.
Okay. Because that's scheduled, I see that there is one that was specific to you, so I'll go ahead and have Maricela ask that question.
Oh, the Peace Corps question?
Yeah.
I get asked that a lot.
Hi,
Yeah.
I'm Maricela. Nice to meet you all. Thank you for your time and sharing your expertise with us. So Santiago, I had a question for you. So I'm very interested in doing Peace Corps. So I kind of wanted to hear how that has led to your current career in diplomacy, and if you do recommend that specific path, because I was thinking that getting hands-on experience is a really good way to start off my career. So I just want to hear a little bit about your perspective on that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a very popular question. I can tell you, when people learn that I was in the Peace Corps, even if it's people outside of government, everyone seems to tell me that they wish they'd done it if they didn't do it. There are quite a bit of people in diplomacy who have that background, having served in the Peace Corps. My experience is just a little bit dated. It's now, I can't believe, 15 years ago, and I know that the Peace Corps has changed quite a bit in some ways. I know that, for example, one of the great benefits of the Peace Corps, and perhaps we can follow this up. I know that we have an FIU alum who's fairly senior at the Peace Corps headquarters, who might be able to better answer this question than me. But when I came back from the Peace Corps, I returned Peace Corps volunteer. There were certain exemptions for applying for jobs within the U.S. government, so that you were a preferred candidate, similar to the way that someone who returns from the armed forces is a preferred candidate for jobs. So you're not competing with as big a pool of candidates for jobs if you want a job in Washington, for example. So I wouldn't say that there's any one path, and I wouldn't choose the Peace Corps as a stepping stone to a career in international affairs. I would choose it because you feel it's the right thing to do, and because you want to serve your country, and because you're interested in helping people from other countries learn about yours. But if it's just a mere stepping stone decision, then I would probably not encourage that, because the Peace Corps is actually a serious thing. It's a challenging thing, and you're a guest in someone else's country, and they're giving a lot of trust to you. And there are days when it gets really hard, and you need a better reason than just a stepping stone to go through it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I see that Nico has a question that is both about a specific population, but also I think more broadly about how a country's diplomatic efforts compete, if you will, for some other priorities. So I'll invite him to ask that question, and then just in the chance that you all might not have a specific response to the specific population, if there might still be comments on other policy priorities possibly detracting from diplomatic efforts. Nico?
Right. Thank you, Eric. And thank you three for joining us here today. Learning a lot as we go. So I've learned that there's been research based on future global aging projections that really describe the overcapacity of elderly populations, especially in the United States. And along with those projections come with the anticipation of decreases in funding for diplomatic initiatives and increases in funding toward elderly welfare to sustain the elderly population. Have you heard necessarily of anything similar? And also, what are your thoughts on that as it relates to the future of both diplomacy and international cooperation?
Nico, I think how it was described in text too is also that the need to serve that population might detract from funding going to other places like diplomacy, right? So do other national needs ever conflict with the funding or attention to diplomatic efforts?
I'll let our panelists, Santiago, if you have a couple of minutes left, do you want to talk about how funding works with Australia for things such as space industry and such? How did they decide to put funding towards that versus other things?
Yes, yeah, no, it's a funny question. So when space emerged as a national strategic priority, but July 2018 was when the agency was officially inaugurated. I wanted to say launched, but it is impossible to work in the space industry without using a space fund. So when the space agency was launched in July 2018, there was very little funding. So a lot of other agencies like mine got pulled into the effort. So for example, the space agency has no people serving abroad. So they rely on a few of us to represent the civil space strategy and the defense space strategy, so the air attaché, myself. So things get funded sometimes in Australia as they go. So once you prove the concept, then the money follows. So in the case of space, as I said, we started with very little money, and a lot of us just kind of giving our time to that effort. And then in September of last year, 2019, the Prime Minister of Australia came for a state visit to the US, to Washington. And he signed a commitment of $150 million at NASA headquarters to support global efforts for Moon to Mars. And so that was $150 million. And now that money is getting allocated to specific projects. A lot of them are commercial in nature because you need Australian industry supporting US industry supporting NASA. Australia won't launch people to space the way that NASA will, but Australia will provide technologies like robotics and Earth observation and things like that. So things get funded as they go. The money then flows, and then you allocate it across different areas of need. Thank you.
Thank you. Abdel, I'll let you speak on behalf of the US. I think we've all seen the various budget debates that go on every year for us.
Definitely. And this is, I want to clarify, it's sort of my observations more than particularly the Department of State's position. But you're completely correct, Miko, and thank you for your question on the elderly population. I think especially the current pandemic that we're living has provided an opportunity for the world to realize how vulnerable a lot of the elderly population could be. And so I would suspect in the near future at a federal level, both in the US, but also internationally, we will start seeing priorities that would attach more funding to some groups and additional funding. There's always an apparatus of funding for these groups, but additional funding. In regards to budget and how things are allocated and sort of how money runs, right? I'd like to just say a few things. One, the budget of the Department of State represents about 1% of the overall sort of a budget of our federal budget, which is something that we always talk about because we have all these diplomats around the world doing really important work on a budget that is not at times comparable. But I know that there are some strides to make that better. I like to say how some of the funding streams to groups, we talked a lot about civil society and NGOs, and a lot of the funding that we are able to provide overseas come through our public diplomacy efforts. And our public diplomacy colleagues, they have what's called grants, and they offer grants to special groups. And that includes exchanges with the United States. That also includes, for example, like running a program, a health initiative, or in a small village, bringing a water pump or something along those lines. And so the funding streams from Washington comes to our posts through different programs, and then we go out and talk to groups and evaluate whether these programs are in line with our values as a nation, right? And then we provide that funding. And then we also monitor that it's actually carried out and there's a deliverable there. So that's sort of how it trickles down to societies. And each agency has their pot of money while overseas as well, and they're able to utilize those funds to advance any such priority. And so that's more or less how we're structured.
Thank you.
Thanks both. I see that Jennifer has a question that is about a comment that all three of you shared, an experience all three of you shared, but I think she wants a little more on how you respond to that situation. So Jennifer, you want to jump in with that?
Yes, good morning, Jennifer Puentes, and I'm doing a master's in international and intercultural education. And I've done a lot of trips overseas for leisure business. And the first thing I get, but you don't look like an American. And even when I was in the military, which actually worked to our benefit for some reason. But how do you respond to that? Like, how do you say, I'm still representing and I'm still an American?
I'll let you guys give your answer and I'll give mine as the only woman on the panel. At least we don't have a manel today completely.
Yeah, so I can go quickly. I can tell you, when I go to events here in Washington and they say, the director of space industry at the Australian Embassy, and then someone says my name and they're like, that doesn't sound like, Crocodile Dundee or anything like that. And then I speak and they're like, that doesn't sound Australian. And then you remind people that Australia is over 25% foreign born, which people don't know. So it's always an interesting thing, but you learn to, yeah, I mean, that's just the world. That's not your problem. That's perhaps other people's problems, not understanding how the world is. I can tell you just a quick anecdote from when I was an American abroad back in 2005 in Kazakhstan. I was probably the first American they'd seen that maybe wasn't in a movie. And in the Soviet Union, our former Soviet Union, there's in the villages, there's very little showers, but you still need to take a bath. So you go to these communal bathhouses. And yeah, pretty much the first few times I went to the communal bathhouse, people were shocked that the anatomy of someone who's an American was the same as theirs, which is, so yeah, people staring at you. And then I felt a little bit like a mix of Tom Cruise, because everyone had so much interest in every mundane thing I did. People were approaching me, taking photographs of me going to like the grocery store. But also Bozo the Clown, because anytime I did anything that was a little bit funny, everyone would laugh and comment and behind my back and create stories and anecdotes that people shared in the village. So it's a weird thing, but you learn to laugh with people and just appreciate the funny side of the situation.
I just to add a few things on that, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, how as a consular officer, we see it every day because we are the face that people see more often, right? We have our clients that show up every morning and they expect to see this, tall, white, blue-eye person. And when they get someone that maybe has an accent, that maybe is not the same skin color as they had in their mind, it becomes sort of a little bit of a culture shock for them. But I also want to point out that it's happened to me also in dealing with Americans. So it's not just in dealing with our foreign hosts. I've actually been in the consular section. We have American Citizen Services, and we provide important services for Americans overseas, like if you lose your passport, etc. So I've had Americans come, and I'm here trying to help them get back to their country, and they're like, I want to talk to a real American. And I'm like, oh. So I do this thing where I get up, I do like a little turn, and I sit right back down. I take it as a moment of, as an opportunity to teach also our citizens that, we shouldn't be putting people in buckets based on what you think people look like. And that's just a philosophy that we also, as America, try to advance overseas, right? That's one of the values that we sort of expand. So, we deal with this every time. I mentioned my name's Abdel, and I have absolutely no Muslim or Middle Eastern connection. Absolutely, it was a name they liked out of a book. But in some cultures, and I worked in Islamabad, it's unacceptable that I had received that name just based on that, right? And so it was, at times you just have to let it go and be like, sure, okay, and focus on other things, and maybe take that opportunity to teach something to the person. And that's how I've dealt with it. I think some colleagues have had really tough issues in places where they've served. If they're, LGBT community, our African American friends, it really has posed an issue. But the department has been very strategic in trying to increase that diversity in its workforce. And we have the fellowship front, that I received, actually recruits individuals from poorly represented sectors of our society in the United States to join the Foreign Service. And so, I definitely encourage everyone, and I'm happy to share more information on this, but if you haven't done your research on it, the Charles B. Rango International Affairs Fellowship and the Pickering International Affairs Fellowship, both are instrumental in recruiting diversity in the Foreign Service. So you can help us also address this internationally.
Great. I will just add quickly that I don't necessarily not look like an American. People aren't surprised, but they are surprised that I'm a woman in a role of authority. When I was in Lyon, I was the youngest. I was the youngest official diplomat. We had about 11 consulates and then a bunch of honorary consuls who were all 60, 70-year-old men who wanted to treat me like their daughter. And so you really have to, you joke with them, you remind them that you're representing the United States, that in our country we're a little more egalitarian and we hire people based on merit, and push that, you use it as an opportunity to teach people about I hate to use the American dream, but the ability of anyone in the United States to reach the role of a senior diplomat at a certain age as a woman without family or background or things that would help them get there.
Thank you so much for that. Appreciate it.
I see that Carlos is putting some of these links to these particular fellowship programs. So thank you for that, Carlos. I'm also adding Rebecca's diplomat in residence email address to get in touch with her. And I always recommend checking out careers.state.gov very thoroughly before reaching out to Rebecca, so that you're prepared to ask her the questions that need to be asked after reviewing the website. Just to make sure this is career oriented, I'll check to see if Rebecca wants to add anything else about engaging with her or about these fellowship programs. And there was one interesting question in here about an internship path that I'll just go ahead and ask for time's sake, which is whether interning in a foreign embassy would be something that is useful or counts towards a career in the U.S. Foreign service.
So this would be someone, an American interning at a foreign embassy overseas or here in the United States. Is that the gist of the question?
That's what I got from the reading. Let's see who asked, and I'm glad to have them hop on. There's a lot of text going on here. But that was my reading of the question,
Okay.
wherever the text question ended up.
So I can say something really quickly about that. As Abdel was saying and Santiago was saying, all experience is good experience. And I had one intern, she was dual national French and American, and ended up doing her internship at our consulate in Lyon as a French citizen instead of as an American citizen, because the process was actually easier to get through for French interns who might want to intern at one of our embassies or consulates. The only thing that we caution people on is if you are a dual citizen and you spend more time interning as your other citizenship versus your US citizenship, it can complicate your security clearance in some ways, because what they're looking at is that your loyalty is to your American citizenship, to the United States, that's your main identity. And if you have been interning mostly as a French citizen or as, some other, a Spanish citizen, whatever, then that begins to ask you, whether you see yourself more as French or Spanish or Venezuelan or Japanese than American. And so that's the only thing that we caution people to think about if they're thinking of going that way. But all experience is good experience.
And there's, of course, I think, Abdel, you served as an intern at the U.S. Embassy in Montevideo, right? So there's the flip side of that, where you can go abroad and you can get an internship, provide a service to a U.S. consulate general or embassy abroad.
Yes, we have lots of internship opportunities. We also, and I'm happy to talk about this with people individually if they want to reach out to me, we also have virtual internships now that will open up July 1st, because with everything that's going on, some of our in-person internships, especially for the summer, were canceled, unfortunately, but we're really trying to increase the opportunities for virtual internships, working either with, and it's with most federal agencies, not just the Department of State.
Great. I just contributed the link to that to Virtual Student Federal Service, which
Thank you.
so definitely follow up with Rebecca. I want to, I think, Carlos and I have one closing sort of thought or what someone to hear about, but I want to go ahead and thank Santiago, Santiago, it's a pleasure to meet you today, and thank you for doing this. And Abdel, pleasure to see you again, and Rebecca, pleasure to see you again. And couldn't imagine having this panel without you and the service you provide to the FIU students in South Florida more broadly for making the Foreign Service representative and recruiting them. Abdel, with you being in Italy, I know we wanted to thank you for your particular service to the U.S. during this particular time. I know Carlos and I were wondering if you had anything you wanted to share about your experience in Italy during this time, or that country was so particularly hard hit by this pandemic.
Well, thank you again to FIU and to all of you for putting this together. One of my best experiences was being in DC with our office there in DC and the programming that you all put together as an intern in Washington myself. So I'm always happy to come back and sort of talk to students. It's been the most interesting time for me professionally and personally, because you think you're coming to Italy on an assignment, and it's the dream assignment for a lot of people, right? It's one of those things that people in the Foreign Service always maybe spend 20 years in their careers, and then they end up in one of these posts. And I found myself very fortunate to be here during the last year and a half that I've been here. But it's been a sort of a welcome challenge, and I say this because I think what we do overseas is very important. I think I saw a question earlier today on more policy related and more specific on the debates that are currently happening in the U.S. and sort of the aid that we're providing and things like that. I'm in no position, of course, to make any official statement on behalf of the U.S. government here, but what I can say that personally, it's been rewarding to see how much we can do to help in a situation, and how much time we spend overseas on helping American citizens. You've seen the stories publicly around the world. Americans are being repatriated back to the homeland, back to the U.S., and that's a really good story, because that's your taxpayers at work. Like your taxpayer money at work here. Getting people back to the United States. And so personally, I was evacuated from Milan because it became the epicenter of sort of the crisis, but we continue to work. And I think that's the resiliency you learn in the Foreign Service, is that you open up your computer, you keep working, you keep trying to advance that mission and help in any way possible. And I just have to say that I'm very proud of all my colleagues who are working here, because they're doing some extraordinary work in trying to balance our priorities in the United States, our priorities here, Italy being one of our closest allies, in the world, really, and trying to provide that support during a really difficult time for both of our countries. And so I'm honored to be sort of in this situation, and I think any opportunity that we get to serve our country and sort of show how we can be of support, I'm always up for a challenge. So I never thought I'd be, my first State Department evacuation would be in Milan, of all places. But that's what the Foreign Service is. You never expect this, and they prepare us for this. So I'm more than happy to be a resource to all of you who are listening. You can get in touch with me through Rebecca, through Eric, through Carlos. And if you have any questions on internships, I'm more than happy also to provide information. At some point I was coined the eternal State Department intern. I had like 3 or 4 internships before I joined, and so I'm more than happy to help.
Great. Thank you. With that, I'll just reiterate the thanks to all 3 of you. It's been a fantastic session, fantastic morning. And for the rest of our group, we will see you back at 1 o'clock. Rebecca, thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and Abdel and Santiago, thank you very much as well.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.